Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome today. I'm Dr. Jennifer Woolard. I'm chair and professor in the psychology department at Georgetown University. And on behalf of our department and the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative, I welcome you to our program this afternoon. You know, in coming from Georgetown as an institution, our university has a commitment to justice and the common good, to creating and communicating knowledge, and to being active participants and encouraging each other to be active participants in civic life. Today's symposium exemplifies those commitments as we discuss one of the most pressing problems facing our society today. But this is not just going to be a university intellectual discussion, although there's a time and place for that. Instead, today, we bring together scholars that manifest the very best of what we call in psychology the scientist practitioner model, in which we strive for the integration of science and the integration of practice in society. Our community research group in the Georgetown Psychology Department has benefited from a long-standing collaboration with the Law Center's Juvenile Justice Clinic, and really stands out for me as an example of partnership across disciplinary boundaries that helps put research into action and help action inform research. I know I speak for both of our groups in expressing appreciation for our speaker and our panelists, and for so many of you that are joining us on the webinar today, who are committed to a just approach and to confronting injustices faced by our children, specifically children of color, who become involved in the justice system through encounters with law enforcement. With that, let me introduce our first speakers for our program today, the Dehumanization of Children of Color, Rethinking Policing and Policy. First, Dr. Phillip Atiba Goff is a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and his PhD in psychology from Stanford. He quickly became a national leader in the science of racial bias by pioneering scientific experiments that exposed how our minds learn to associate Blackness and crime implicitly, often with deadly consequences. This research led Dr. Goff to co-found and now serve as the CEO of the Center for Policing Equity, a university research center now supported by the 501c3 Policing Equity Organization. Created at UCLA, where Dr. Goff took tenure, the center grew to be the world's largest research and action think tank on race and policing. The center also hosts the world's largest collection of police behavioral data in the National Science Foundation funded National Justice Database. This database now serves as a tool to reduce burdensome and inequitable policing through scientific analyses. Dr. Goff has won 2 American Psychological Association Early Career Awards, the Association for Psychological Science Rising Star Award, and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives Lloyd G. Seeley Award, among many others. He regularly appears on cable news, provides congressional testimony, and was a panelist for President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. He is joined by Kristen Henning, who is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she and her law students represent youth accused of delinquency in Washington, D.C. Kris has been representing children arrested in the district for more than 25 years. She was previously the lead attorney for the juvenile unit of the DC Public Defender Service and is currently the director of the Mid-Atlantic Juvenile Defender Center. Professor Henning writes extensively about race, adolescence, and policing, and we are very excited about her book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, which will be published by Penguin Random House later this year. Kris's book illuminates the voices of Black youth and grapples with many of the issues they will talk about today. Kris trains defense attorneys and other juvenile and criminal justice stakeholders across the country on issues like adolescent development and racial bias, and partnered with the National Juvenile Defender Center to launch a racial justice toolkit for youth advocates and to launch the Ambassadors for Racial Justice program for juvenile defenders committed to challenging racial injustice. I'm so excited for our program today. I hope you are as well. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn the program over now to Kris and Dr. Goff. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woolard, for helping us bring together this very important conversation. And thank you so much, Dr. Goff, for joining us. Your research has informed so much of what we do. So let me set the stage a little bit. We have a very large audience with us today. It includes a mixture of judges, court personnel, law enforcement, prosecutors, youth defenders, probation officers, social workers, psychology students and professors, law professors and law students from DC and from around the country. We even have a couple of folks who have joined us internationally. What is clear from the questions that were submitted in advance is that people have joined because they have been working with and talking to children of color for years. And they have been watching the news and the social media, and they are deeply concerned about the policing of Black and brown children in America. They are concerned about how frequently Black and brown children come into contact with the police, especially in those circumstances that are perceived to be unnecessary and avoidable. They are concerned about how quickly those encounters escalate into physical contact and violence. And they are concerned about the ways in which it seems that everyone has forgotten that children are children and that Black and brown children are children too. So many of us watched just last week the video of the 9-year-old girl who was pepper sprayed when she was handcuffed and seated in the backseat of a police car in Rochester. So many of us have seen video footage of Shakara Murphy, who was snatched out of her chair in her math class in South Carolina by a sheriff's deputy. So many of us were devastated to see the footage of Tamir Rice shot to the ground within seconds after officers arrived on at a park gazebo in Cleveland, Ohio, in response to a call for a Black male with a gun, probably fake and probably a child. Those of us who work daily in the juvenile and criminal legal systems, those of us who are parents to Black children, and those of us who are support workers in communities of color know that these incidents are far more pervasive than these high-profile incidents that periodically get circulated on social media. So what we want to do this afternoon is we want to unpack what's happening. We want to learn more about what the psychological research tells us about police encounters with Black and brown youth. We want to understand more about how youth of color perceive police officers and respond to the police. And we want to talk about a way forward. How do we cultivate a society in which we treat all kids like kids? So to make this conversation real and concrete, we thought that Dr. Goff and I would work through a couple of real life experiences. And these are real life experiences shared by the children in the District of Columbia who I have worked with, who have been in contact with the law. As Dr. Woolard said, I have had the honor of representing children who have been arrested in DC for more than 25 years. And I have been collecting stories and thinking a lot about their life experiences. And several of these stories really stood out to me as representative of what is happening across the country. And Dr. Goff has read some of these life experiences, and he agrees these are the kinds of life experiences children see across the country. So I am very honored to be in conversation with Dr. Goff as we continue to think about these experiences and begin to unpack them. So are you ready, Dr. Goff? All right, so let's work through a first story. I'm going to tell you just a moment about a young man that I represented named Andre. And Andre was a 15-year-old Black boy who was walking down the street in Washington, DC with a friend. There was no report of crime. The boys weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. They weren't loud, they weren't smoking, they weren't drinking, yet the police drove up next to them and asked them if they heard any gunshots. When the boys said no, the police officers asked them to show me your waist. Both boys complied by lifting their shirts, but the officers still weren't satisfied and asked the boys for permission to search them, at which point Andre and his friend said yes. 4 uniformed officers jumped out of their car, forced the boys against the wall, and frisked them. As a defense attorney, I am always baffled when children agree to be searched by the police. And when I ask my client, why did you say yes? His response said it all. He looked up and said, wouldn't you? They were going to frisk us anyway. And if we ran, they were just going to shoot us in the back. So let me stop there, Dr. Goff, before I add any more to Andre's story. And let's just start unpacking this so that we can all understand how the research might inform what was going on here. And I want to start with why my client was stopped in the first place and whether you can help us, whether the psychology of policing teaches us anything about why Andre might have been stopped in the first place. And the officers, to be clear, acknowledged readily that there was no report of crime. They conceded readily that they had no other reason to stop him except that the boys consented. But before we talk about the consent, can you help us understand whether and how race might have informed their decision to stop him?
So, Kristen, first of all, thank you for having me, Dr. Willard as well. It's wonderful to be here and be able to engage so deeply in your work, Kristen, and in the lives of the children who you represent and the kids who we need to keep safe and the kids whose childhood we literally need to protect. I want to make a distinction before I dive into the psychology. If you asked me about the psychology of policing and what it could tell us about why that stop happened in the first place, the distinction I want to make is the difference between the psychology of policing, so what's happening in the hearts and minds of officers, and the mission, the purpose of policing. And I actually think in this instance, it's the purpose of policing that's in the driver's seat. So the psychology might say that these two, I believe that Andre was 15 years old.
Yes.
Right? If I'm remembering I read the vignette, so spoiler alert to everybody else. I have other details associated with this. But so Andre's 15 years old. And that gets right at the heart of some of the research that you know that I've done that is nearest and most injurious to my own heart. Because at around the age of 15, Black boys, and we now know from other research, actually by researchers at Georgetown, that Black girls as well, are aged out of childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. So looking at these two teenagers, right, it may very well have been to the officers, they saw men. And for sure, if they saw their skin, we know, and the phenotype, we know that officers and everybody, right? I don't want to put this just on police because we know that sometimes people call the police and are not of pure intentions. We saw that highlighted this summer to less aggrandizement than what we saw in Minneapolis. But still, if they saw race, then they thought criminal, they thought dangerous. So for sure, those are aggravating circumstances. But why the heck did they feel the need to stop anybody in the first place? Why are they asking when there's no reports of crime to see inside on somebody's waist and then to search somebody when all of the things that they saw were not consistent with criminal activity? And the mission of policing begins in this country, the formal mission, with regulating the movement of enslaved former Africans and their descendants. And at no point in time, so let me say, it starts there in some cities. In other cities, by the way, it starts not there, but when the laws of the land are explicitly racist, when Jim Crow is the law of the land, in the nadir and after, who has the job of enforcing racist laws? It would be law enforcement. At no point between emancipation, right, and the present moment have we said, those systems are jacked up. We should be doing something different than that. So it's not to say that law enforcement are the same as slave catchers. Let me be really clear. The nation has evolved. It does not look the same. But we never decided to have a clean break. We never decided to abolish some of the remnants of slavery in the institutions that carried forward, not formally. And so in law enforcement agency after law enforcement agency, if you see two folks in the middle of the day that are not at a job, it can't be that they're going to the doctor. It can't be that they're picking something up on a lunch run. It can't be that they're in the middle of a move. It can't be that they're students out for a long talk about deep ideas. Two Black males in the middle of the day are not where they're supposed to be if they're up to any good. And my job is to regulate their movement, to check their papers, to do some version of making sure that they're the good kind of Black folks. That's a mission issue. That's not the individual. Like it's easy to make 2 officers or 4 officers into bad people. But the reality is we have all on some level consented to law enforcement continuing in that mission. And that's a large part of how so many young Black men, women, boys, and girls get caught up in those kinds of situations.
Excellent. Thank you for laying that historical foundation. So I hear you drawing the thread, the link from the Fugitive Slave Act, right, to the Black codes, to contemporary policing, even though we don't look alike, right? The lineage is very much the same. Can you say a word, though, about racial bias and the ways in which racial bias operates more? And we'll talk a minute about your, if you will allow me, talk about your essence of innocence when we really zero in on children being perceived as older. But just generally speaking, can you help us understand the impact of racial bias in a moment like this?
Absolutely. And so again, I want folks to think about this as an aggravating factor and not the whole story. Because when we talk about racial bias, what we're usually meaning is individual level racial prejudice, right? It's an attitude, either explicit or implicit, right? A cognitive process or a deeply held belief. It's bigotry or it's implicit bias. That's the range of things. If we imagine that the problem is only so large as that, then the solution is really a whole bunch of self-help and religious experiences and encounters with art, right? It's a whole bunch of feel-good stories on morning shows. And I gotta say, that theory of racism, while it's popular and it sells books and it frames a great deal of what happens when we talk about race in America, is neither what the science says, nor is it the experience of Black folk. And so I wanna call out today that if we imagine that we can get through this through self-help books, then our imaginations have failed us. That said, bias is an obvious and an intense aggravating factor. So let's say I'm an officer and I see 2 young-ish men in the middle of the day out and about, right? I got a decision to make about whether or not I want to engage with them, right? Now they're in a neighborhood that I've decided is not a great neighborhood. Well, that's already colored by race almost always. Right? But even if the neighborhood isn't colored by race, right? I look at these 2 folks and I see Black, the automatic association in most people's minds between Black and criminality leads me to think, oh, crime is more likely between the 2 of them. And then once I've got there and they're not giving me any signals that there's a problem, that's now inconsistent with what I walked into. So I'm more prone to investigate further. So at every step along the decisions, there's kind of a set of cascades, right, of heuristics, right, these mental shortcuts that we take that are going to be influenced by bias. Now, bias isn't the only thing, and training, I know it's not popular to say, training can help with that, but training can only help a little bit on a thing that's only a little slice of this individual level within the broader system, right? So it influences everything, it permeates everything during the interaction, but it's only a small slice within each of those elements. And with that, let me give one more layer to all of that. So I described how during a stop, bias might influence behavior. But if we go back to the mission, who set out the metrics for a successful or productive shift? Who set out the statutes that are able to be enforced? And by the way, many people listening to this are in DC. Anybody got any idea where the highest concentration of drug use is in Washington, D.C.? If you said Southeast, you might want to talk to somebody about implicit bias or explicit bias, right? Because the reality is it's college campuses, like it's always been through time immemorial. The Greeks were talking about it, right? In Timbuktu, Burkina Faso, they're talking about it. But we don't think about drug use on college campuses as dangerous in the same way, which, by the way, is to the great regret and the trauma of many women on campus, because sexual violence is so often associated with substance abuse and misuse. But because we've decided that's not the kind of drug or substance abuse that we find dangerous, we don't see anybody setting up stings in the common area. The result of that is all of those decisions that are invisible in that moment, but so dramatically overdetermine all the outcomes, they're also infused with bias, right? From the crack powder discrepancy, which is sort of the obvious and caricatured one, all the way down to in Colorado when they repealed all of the anti-marijuana laws, except for the ones about consumption in open air markets, which are disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, so that the rate of arrests for marijuana in Colorado went down very, very low. But the disparities, the racial disparities increased. That's where bias is. It lives in the nooks and crannies of every decision that we make. And so we can't make it the whole deal, but we also can't look at it just at the moment of the encounter. We have to understand how it shapes the context where the encounters happen in the first place.
Thank you so much for this. I have to say that I love working with my psychologist friends because they push us lawyers to be more nuanced. And I love it. This isn't just literally black and white in so many senses, but you force us to recognize race as an aggravator that permeates at multiple layers of decision making. And later on in this conversation, after you and I talk, we're going to have this policy conversation. So understanding how policy affects some of these macro decisions, regulatory decisions, and the like is going to be really important. So thank you for that frame for us. So I want to go back to the fact that Andre was 15, right? And so I would think, I want to believe that I live in a society, a Western culture that prides itself on notions of innocence, right? And so I would have thought that age would mitigate these racialized fears that permeate at multiple levels, but that when you see Andre, when you see a little boy, when you see a Tamir Rice, for example, that age would have mitigated some of the stereotypes and some of the racial bias. But I mean, we know, both of us know, and certainly in my practice and my research, that youthful age seems to do nothing or very little to reduce fears about Black children, not just among the police, but period, throughout society. And so many people, I am sure, have signed on to hear you talk about your Essence of Innocence article. But can you just, briefly sort of set the stage? You started to talk about it, but say more about this notion, about perceptions of youth, Black youth being older.
Yeah, and so in doing this work, we were really inspired by Sandra Graham and Brian Lowry, who had done a version of it prior to ours, right? And then as our stuff was coming out, also Anita Rattan had done her work. So there are folks who have done that, as I've said, your colleagues at Georgetown have now done it with girls. But the goal for us was to see literally what are the protective properties of youth in potentially deadly encounters with the state. And like you said, you would hope that childhood is a category that protects you from the harshest responses of punishment, right? If every time a child is acting out, we beat them unconscious, the problem is not the child, the problem is us, right? So anyway, that was the thought. The research, we had pictures of school-age children at different studies. We had them as young as 10, as old as 17. And we just asked, we described their behavior either as having been suspected of engaging in a misdemeanor or suspected of engaging in a felony. We just asked people, college undergraduates, the general population, and then eventually law enforcement, how old do you think this person is? Staring at their photo. And when they were suspected of a felony, Black boys were seen as 4.5 years older than they really were. And for white boys, it was actually almost a reaction against it. They were seen as younger than they were, as if, well, they look too young to have committed that. They got extra protections. Now, it's a much smaller effect. I think it's about like a half a year. But still, they got extra protections when dealing with the cops. Now, interestingly, law enforcement were more accurate than the population at large. We're more accurate. So I don't want to make this into just law enforcement are peculiarly, like this is a human psychological thing in this country, in this context. But Imagine if you're 13 and all of a sudden you got 4.5 years. Now, when we first got it, we were very worried because, you know, as a scientist, you're like, that feels like that could definitely be error. Like, let's run that again. So we ran several studies on it. We're like, wow, that's super robust. We keep getting the same thing. When we published it, we got some folks who said the same. They said, well, that seems like a really big effect. And then there was Tamir Rice shortly thereafter. Tamir Rice, as you brought up his name, you invoked his name. When the officers got out, it was less than 2 seconds before they pulled the trigger, ending his life. And they called it in, black male, likely 20 years old. Tamir Rice was 12. In the world, what's happening is essentially people are erasing the period between childhood and adulthood for Black folks. And if you'll permit me, I feel like it's useful to talk. I mean, it's titled Dehumanization, so let me get the dehumanization part in here. So, you know, I use this as the example when I try to explain this in my classes and when I'm giving lectures or any other place, I guess at coffee parties or coffee tables and dinner parties when they let me. When you go to the zoo with a kid, like they want to go see the lions and they want to see the tigers and the wolves and the bears, the predators, or they want to see even more than that, the baby lions and the baby tigers with the little like the pint-sized roars. When was the last time that you thought about going, you saw an adolescent lion or an adolescent tiger, an adolescent wolf, any kind of adolescent predator? You don't think like that, though those biological categories absolutely exist, because socially the category of adolescence is uniquely human. And that's the rub. Because if a group doesn't get to have the full benefits of being human, the category of adolescence is gone and you have either childhood or large enough to hurt me, which is adulthood. And that's what's happening to Black boys and Black girls across this country. They're literally being robbed of the stage at which it's okay to figure out how you move from being a dependent and a child into responsibility for yourself. Anybody who's listening ever make a mistake while they were growing up? Does that ever happen to anybody, or is it just me? Was I the only one who ever made mistakes? And if we get punished as if disobedience or confusion or anger misdirected as we're figuring out our role is actually defiance of the law, then you end up handcuffing and pepper spraying a 9-year-old girl who's asking for her daddy. You can talk about that as the savagery of the individual officers who were responsible for that. But if we miss the fact that that's been part of the mission of law enforcement since the beginning, to do that not to children, but to Black children, to Black bodies, then we're going to be unable to remedy what ails us. I really hope that we're thinking as large as this moment if we're going to really be serious about remedy, because there's now an opportunity to do something as large as the history of oppression and erasure of Black humanity.
And really, I love how you continue to invoke history, because for those of us who spend a lot of time studying adolescent development, there is also the argument that adolescence as a developmental stage was designed or invented from the outset to cater to and to serve white middle-class youth whose parents at the shift into the industrial era said, look, we need our kids to stay home and get educated so they can get better jobs. Mm-hmm. So we're gonna elongate this period. We're gonna now not just have childhood and adulthood, but we're gonna have this period of growth and experimentation. And from the outset, it was perceived that Black youth didn't get that benefit from the very beginning. And so now, right, policing is yet another, contemporary policing is yet another way to deprive Black and brown youth of that adolescence. So I really just wanted to highlight the historical links that we continue to see, and we've got to grapple with that reality. So I want to sit with remedies for just a second, right? So Dr. Woolard and I, for example, are currently working with the DC Metropolitan Police Department to develop a training module specifically to address this intersection of race and adolescent development. Our, the evidence shows that not only is there the notions of racial bias that permeate through all facets of decision making, but that also police officers across the country have not yet been adequately trained on adolescent development and how to work with young people. So we've been asked to come in and help them do that. And so my question for you is, what do you want us to tell them, right? So I know, the race trait, right? Thank you, Dr. Goff. You can do our job for us, right? But the race piece is just a small piece. It's one of the layers. It's an aggravating factor, and we'll talk about that. But what are the other remedies that you have and your colleagues have been proposing, like your article, Risky Situations? And I love how you're calling out articles for people to read, which is really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, what would I have you tell them? I think mostly stop messing with our kids. Like, let it be simple, right? Like, I start there, that a state punishment response to childhood mistakes is absolutely a barbaric response, and that our society as a whole will be judged for that. That's where I'd start. There are a number of sort of picayune, what'll feel like ticky-tack sets of things, like asking for age. Because it turns out if you ask for age, you can know, no way, you 15. 15? I have to treat you like a 15. Okay, cool. Right. Teaching folks about adolescent development, the adolescent brain, which is, I mean, for anybody who's ever dealt with adolescence at a regular point, is not the same brain as other brains. Like, teach them about that. But there are deeper elements that I hope that we're going to be able to get to. I think about the work of Nikki Jones. She has an article called The Regular Routine and a book called Between Good and Ghetto. But in the work that she does, the stat that hits me, 51% of the Black girls in juvenile detention facilities or under juvenile correctional surveillance identify as queer or gender nonconforming. 51%. You don't get that by accident. We are actually literally policing Black femininity and punishing it with the state. Now, Nikki doesn't pretend to know all the mechanisms that lead us to that, and neither do I. But when you have disparities like that, you can't get them by accident. And so what I need our systems to do is to start looking at the outcomes that will reveal the inequalities within those systems and working backwards from those outcomes to figure out, how did we end up producing these systems that give us so much pain on the other side? I want people to be held accountable to their values. And unfortunately, because we live in a world of performance management, we manage the outcomes that we think are easy to measure as opposed to the outcomes that matter to us, right? And our systems of criminal legal intervention are worse even than that, because oftentimes they don't bother to measure anything at all. And think about how that feels in communities that have been forgotten, where the children are descendants of enslaved Americans. To have a country that measures every damn thing, not measure anything about how the state purveys violence on those descendants of formerly enslaved peoples. So the simple versions of these that I would give: stop messing with our kids.
Love it.
Look at the outcomes and measure anything at all. Look at the outcomes that we care about and measure anything at all.
Yes. I hope we can get back to talk about, when I talk about measuring, I also want to measure the traumatic effects of policing on children of color, the psychological trauma that is imposed through policing. But let's build our way there. And I think we can get there close to there with this question, which is, so I want to go back to this consent question, right? As I indicated to you, I was baffled by why Andre would have complied with the police officer's request to lift his shirt. And in fact, in the District of Columbia, it's so common now, police officers drive up and in front of a group of Black boys on the corner And without even being asked now, the boys just lift their shirts. That's what we're seeing all over the place. And so I wanted to get underneath that a little bit. Is there something in the research that helps us understand what is going on with Andre and his friend at that moment? I mean, obviously there's the very clear answer that my client gave me, wouldn't you say yes? Because I'm gonna get shot and run. But even beyond that, can you talk to us a little bit about the trauma that young people face? And I know in particular, you have written about the mismeasure of Terry stops, the ways in which we are miscalculating the harms of Terry stops.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is got so many different layers. Let me start with just the question of why on earth would you consent to your own oppression? And from the outside, it almost begs a kind of victim blaming, like, why would you do that to yourself? And I'm so glad that your client was so clear, right? Just like, because that's the logical thing to do. I hate to make these comparisons because they are not the same, but I think it becomes easier to read when we read some things together. Lots of times, so my history in activism actually begins with dealing with folks who are survivors of sexual assault and then with perpetrators of sexual assault. And lots of folks who are survivors of intimate partner or domestic violence get the question at some point, why on earth did you stay? And the question, depending on who's asking it, can be of violence. Because the rationale is, well, if I tried to go and it didn't work, do you know what would happen to me? If I showed that I was resistant and non-compliant, do you know what would happen to me? By the way, how many times have we seen some of those brutal videos and people say out loud, well, why didn't you just comply? Because I've tried complying and they do the same thing. One of the most heartbreaking videos I've ever seen, again, back to Nikki Jones, in the research she was doing in front of the regular routine. She has a young man, right, who I believe it was in Oakland, getting approached by, and I say young man, he's a boy, somewhere between 14 and 16, approached by a white male officer. They know each other. He says, hey man, like I thought I saw you hanging over there where you weren't supposed to be. He said, no, I wasn't over there at all. What are you talking about? I wasn't over there at all. He's like, yeah, well, I thought that. Come on. He puts it just like this with his finger. The child lifts up his shirt, right? Holds it under his chin, puts hands up. And as the man's hands are going around his bare exposed stomach, he turns because he understands he's going to need to show his backside and front, all to be searched under the waistband by this officer. The pain is not that it happened. It's that it was part of a well-orchestrated dance. They knew the moves and they coordinated it together. The first time you might be confused and trying to assert, but if you feel physical threat after that, you consent. And then after you've consented, there's a momentum that says, if I don't do this, how much worse could happen? And that has now been shared over social media so many times. I cannot imagine there's a single child in the United States that thinks it would end otherwise. So the reason for the yes is multifaceted, right? But that's one component of it. The other piece I would say is this. We all are, like, the way that we manage the social contract in the United States is deontologically, right? We have rights, right? And you and I, we know those rights because we read law. I'm not a lawyer, but I teach at a law school, right? We read law and we understand the context where precedent says we're allowed to exercise those rights. But the rights are only as valid as they are protected and exercised. That means if I say I have a right to free speech, which is really about the government and not about Twitter, in case anybody's confused, if I say I have a right to free speech and police beat me publicly for speaking out against the government, and then a judge finds me guilty of aggravating law enforcement and I serve time for it, I don't have that right. And Black folks in general, Black children in particular, are aware they don't experience the rights with the same robustness as the rest of the country. So I want to go back to, it's reasonable. These people are making smart, good, sound decisions for the situation they find themselves in. And if we find that enraging, change the systems that make them right, rather than blaming for them for being accurate within the systems.
Superb. I just need to carry you around with me when I go to court, and I'll be like what he just said. So I have been writing, some people will know that I've been writing about the reasonable Black child standard and this notion of rights and protections. I absolutely have to underscore what you said. I am absolutely convinced that no Black child in the United States of America in today can voluntarily consent to a search, right? On the street, a street search without a lawyer present, without consultation. And even then, I worry about it, right? I am convinced that no Black child can reasonably, fairly, voluntarily consent to interrogation and to waive their rights to be interrogated without a lawyer present. So I get a little on my soapbox about this, but when we have our policy conversation in a few minutes with the rest of our panelists, that's some of the kinds of conversations we have to have. Can the legislative body, can our council members, can we abolish consent searches such that a young Black child doesn't walk down the street and not have the right to privacy that the rest of us take for granted?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, I think that the law has a hard time dealing with this because America is a uniquely historically amnesiac country. But American history, US history, is coercion. Full stop. Our history is coercion, right? If you and I are having an interaction and you punch me in the face once and I know I'm never gonna see you again, that's real different than if you live on my block or if you live in my house. And it could happen anytime. And we as a people have been getting punched in the face and kicked in the gut and dragged through the streets for generations. American history is coercion. So how can you give free consent in the face of knowledge of our history?
Amen. Is this church or is this politics? No.
You know what? You pick. I'm always of it, even if I'm not in it.
You're up for either. We're good. We're good. Okay. This is what I want to do for us. I want to give you one more very short hypothetical, right? It's not even a hypothetical. These are lived experiences. Every example that I give you is from a young person. And that's going to allow us to talk about one more concept before you have to leave us. And so it is this. I'm going to talk to you about a client that we represented called Tariq. So Tariq was a young, also teenage boy, lives in an apartment complex in Northeast DC. And like all kids, he likes to visit his family and friends at the building next door. At about 10 a.m. one Saturday morning, Tariq walked out of the building, headed down the walkway, and just as he got to the sidewalk, he saw a police car with two officers staring at him. The sight, just the mere sight of those two officers caused him to hesitate and created the slightest break in his stride, which the officers called a stutter step.
Yep.
Police, you've heard it before, right? You don't even have to be in DC, right? Police officers then followed him in their cruiser. They pulled up on the curb. They jumped out to follow him on foot. Instinctively, Tariq took off running and ultimately hid behind a bush. When the police officers grabbed him, they kept yelling, "Why are you running? Why are you running?" At which point Tariq said, "Because you're chasing me." And this is such a classic exchange between Black youth and police in America. So I want you to talk to us about that. My guess from my reading of your work and many others who have written about stereotype threat is that maybe this is what was going on in Tariq's head. This pervasive sense that, or pervasive fear that he was going to be targeted, labeled, or approached as criminal. And that's what caused that moment. What was so tragic about the moment then is that the officers then use his running away to say, "See, I told you he was suspicious and up to no good." So can you help us understand this concept?
I mean, yeah, I can, but you just explained it, right? Like the concern with being stereotyped or confirming a negative stereotype about one's group can lead somebody to do all kinds of things, including escape the context, right? So that stereotype threat's usually studied in academic contexts. So it's usually women who are in math and science domains, worry about being stereotyped as bad at math because they're women. Black folks in academic domains in generally, stereotyped negatively as academically inferior because they're Black. But Black folks get stereotyped as criminal all the time, right? And so this is work that Cindy Nijdowski has done primarily, and part, I've been lucky enough to collaborate with her, showing that, yeah, young folks, college age folks and younger, and older folks have the same reaction that everybody has when they see a cop behind them, which is, oh, if I share a funny little anecdote, I was in a sergeant's SUV on the way to the airport. We were in a caravan because I had a team that was going to the airport. We've been working with law enforcement. And I was having this lovely conversation with a woman who was in uniform. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see the cop car behind us, part of the caravan. I reached out and grabbed her arm. I was like, yo, 5-0. Because, and she said, you know what? And I started laughing. She's laughing. She's like, you know what? I do that all the time, right? I forget I'm in uniform, and that's what happens. But for Black folks, even more so, because of what the consequences are likely to be. It's not just that there's an authority figure whose job it is to do bad things to you. It's an authority figure whose job it might be to round you up, regulate the movements of your body, and even to exterminate you, right? So yeah, if I see law enforcement behind me, I'm wondering in my city, do I know the chief? Can I make a reference? How do I make sure that they know that I'm not somebody that they can kill with impunity? That's the thinking of me. And I work with about a third of my organization, retired law enforcement. I talk to cops every day, and that's me out on the street, right? Knowing what the full humanity of law enforcement is, that the vast majority that I engage with are good human beings trying to do the right thing in a jacked up system, right? So you explained it exactly. What Tarika's likely going through is a form of stereotype threat, but it's also just the right kind of fight or flight. Making a calculation, I might be able to get away. And if I don't, this could turn into a form of torture for me, right? My hands will be handcuffed. I'll be put in solitary. I might be beaten. Chemicals that are banned in warfare might be used on me. Like, if I describe it that way, yeah. So would you run or consent to have your arms painfully behind your back and restraints that can bruise and cause nerve damage, and have chemicals used on you that are banned in warfare, right? Like, cage or running? A lot of folks are running. And again, that's a reasonable perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And look, you know, the perfect way to end is to circle us back to the 9-year-old girl we've been talking about from Rochester, right? One of the most profound things that I saw in that video at one point. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I implore you to go look it up, watch the video. We've got a police officer who is called regarding family trouble. The police had been told the girl was suicidal, right? Police handcuff her, put her in the back seat while she's crying hysterically, as Dr. Goff said, crying for her father. And at one point, one of the officers said to her, "Stop acting like a child," to which she replies, "I am a child," right? And it's just everything that unfolds from there. The officer manager, the female officer manages to get her in the back seat while you can hear another officer, a male officer, saying over and over, "Well, just go ahead, just pepper spray her now, just go ahead, just do it." And then he leans in and pepper sprays her. And that to me is sort of a visual summary of everything that we, in a lot of ways, a lot of what we have been talking about. And so I guess my last just question for you is your parting words. What are the parting lessons do you want everyone to walk away, you know, from Andre's story, from Tarek's stories, from the 9-year-old girl's story, from Tamir's story, from Shakara's story? What's the takeaway? And I'll let you say yours. I can imagine where you're going to start.
Yeah, so I mean, I struggle increasingly in this moment that we're in, where we get to think bigger about how we can engage with the criminal legal system, about what the one or two takeaways could be. Yeah. You know, I think importantly, at the center of this for me at this moment is the question: why on earth did we think that punishment was the right solution for the policy failures that put people in those positions in the first place, right? So if we think about poverty as a policy failure and every broken law as a policy failure, right, then we end up blaming people for their choices instead of taking responsibility for the options we gave them. And I want people to understand that the criminal legal system is not for bad people. It's for people we've given terrible options and then they picked one of them. That's really what that looks like. But I want to make it even worse. I want people to understand it and feel it even deeper. There's new research that we're in the publication process, where we looked at use of force for Black and white adults and children. I'll skip ahead. The racial disparity between Black and white children is more than twice the racial disparity for Black and white adults.
Mm.
But worse than that, benchmarking against arrest rates in the cities, I think it was across 9 cities, in the cities where we're working, or in those cities where we were working. So the race and age arrest rates, you're more likely to get beat up by the cops as a Black child than as a white adult. And let me say that even plainer. Whiteness is more protective than childhood. We have great ability for empathy and for humanity in this country. We give it to folks all the time. We open up new categories. If you look at what was going on in the mid-'80s, the crack crisis was happening at the exact same time as an eating disorder crisis. But the crack crisis was affecting mostly young Black men. And of the same age, the eating disorder crisis was happening to young white women. The public health response and outpouring around eating disorders at the exact same time for the same age, but different race and gender, tells you what's possible in this country. I do not believe that we're a nation of heartless folks. I believe that the humanity of Black folks is neither visible nor vital in the hearts and minds of folks, nor in the policies we live with. And so we must insist both in telling the truth about how we got here and in telling the truth about what here is. We are not a full democracy. We are not an equal place. We do not value each other equally. And our policies are set up with the truth of that. And if we can't imagine a world that needs to reckon with that as the starting point, then we're only imagining fictions.
I don't even know whether to just say amen or drop the mic, but that's a really extraordinarily powerful way to end this segment of this conversation so we can move into our policy conversation. I honestly cannot say thank you enough for the work that you do. I have to say that your work has been invaluable to me as a defender, as I try to understand my clients better, as I think about how to litigate various aspects of the law, as I train lawyers, police officers, other state actors in the system, and as I think about what legislative, regulatory, and other policy reforms are necessary. And so I just want to say thank you for being here, this marriage between psychology and allowing us to use your work as we think about what to do next. I will keep my Google alert on Dr. Phillip Atiba Goff, so I know anytime you have something new coming out. I have incorporated all of your research in my own writing, my own books. And so thank you for what you do. I certainly invite you to stay with us. I know you are a very, very busy one, but feel free to please stay with us. I'm gonna ask our Attorney General, Carl Racine, our Council Member, Charles Allen, our wonderful Samantha Davis from Black Swan Academy, and our Director for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, Michael Umpierre, to all turn on their screens and join us, if you will. So, thank you all just for joining. And I know many of you, all of you have been listening to much of this conversation. And I am really excited about this opportunity to talk concretely about how we bridge research into practice. And that's what Dr. Woolard talked about at the beginning. We were really excited to have this conversation so we can learn from one another. And to give just a bit more of an introduction for those folks who are not from Washington, DC, we've got our DC Council member, Charles Allen, who for over a decade has worked in Ward 6, helping to improve our public schools, working with small businesses, and building community. Especially important for today's conversation, he is the chair of the Council's Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. So we're so grateful that you would take an opportunity to join us. We also have with us Samantha Davis, who has been elevating the voices of young people of color in the District of Columbia, especially the voices of young Black girls through the Black Swan Academy, which she founded at the tender age of 25 to serve as a pipeline to youth advocates. She also serves on the DC Police Commission. We have our wonderful Attorney General, Carl Racine, who I think he turned off his screen, but he'll come back. Oh, no, there you are. You're on twice. Excellent. So we have our Attorney General, Carl Racine, who has repeatedly identified juvenile justice reform as one of your priorities from day one in office back in 2015. And I just want to say thank you personally every time I ask you to participate in a conversation about race and adolescence. You make yourself available, and that says a lot about your leadership. So thank you also for joining this conversation. And then we have Michael Umpriere, who brings us both a local and a national perspective to this conversation as the current director of the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown, but who has also served in more than one agency in the District of Columbia, including the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, where he was previously Chief of Staff, and where he was a staff attorney at the DC Public Defender Service. So we are so happy to have you all to engage and to move this conversation forward. So this is what we're going to do for the remainder of our time. I want to engage you in 2 rounds of questions. And in the first rounds of questions, I'm going to work through with each of you where we have been and where we are now in the District of Columbia. And then in the second round, I'm going to come back around and talk to each of you about what's next and what do we still need to do to treat all children like children. And so we have received a lot of questions from the audience in advance of this presentation, and so I will weave those through. What I'd like to do is to start with Ms. Davis. And as indicated, you founded the Black Swan Academy, which works to empower Black youth in DC to get involved, to become civic leaders and to push for change. And so you just heard us talk for the last about 45 minutes about over-policing and how over-policing dehumanizes and traumatizes Black youth. And so with our real intention on elevating those youth voices, can you weigh in? Did that conversation that you heard between myself and Dr. Goff and the examples that we shared, did that resonate with what you have heard directly from the youth that you work with as well?
Absolutely, 100%. And as unfortunate as that might be, the reality is young people, Black young people, brown young people here in DC have been calling for folk to simply love them, not harm them, right? At the very basic level, which looks like divestment and those things that cause harm, as well as investment and all of those things that actually keep us safe and healthy and create a more equitable place. To insert youth voice, I can share one of our youth leaders, Samia, 16-year-old, recently said, "There are police everywhere. We have to be quiet and watch our backs before school, after school, and during school. When can we be free?" Right? And so young people feel the weight of over-policing, of criminalization, and other young people will call out. One of our 15-year-olds, London, always says when he talks about this subject, he always points out that police are contributing to the adultification and the erasure of Black childhood, right? Words echoed from what we heard earlier, but words of a 15-year-old young person here in DC. And so absolutely resonates deeply in what young people are experiencing and points us in a very clear direction, I think, that young people clearly say that police do not make them feel safe, that they are the source of fear and trauma. And what I, in Black Swan, has been moving forward with is naming that the theory that youth are going to be better off when we invest in police, instead of investing into youth themselves, instead of investing into our communities themselves, is not only flawed, but it is violent and it perpetuates racism.
And we're definitely going to come back and we're going to talk about these ideas. Some of the questions that were submitted in advance were about, so what are the alternatives? What do we need to invest in? So at the, in round 2, I'm definitely going to come back and talk to you about this. So let me ask you though, I love that your example was a 16-year-old Samia. And I thought Dr. Goff did a great job of elevating the voices of Black girls. And in the examples that I gave, my two examples happen to be Black males, but I also represent a number of young Black girls who get arrested and charged in the District of Columbia. And so what I really want to hear you say is are there ways in which Black girls and brown girls experience policing similarly or differently than Black boys and brown boys?
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the question. One of, I think, the failures, or one of the ways that I believe policy has failed us historically, is that we recognize, or at this point, we're recognizing the way that policing and the dehumanization of Black people is rooted in racism, but it's also rooted in patriarchy, right? And so this understanding that we must look at policy knowing that there is no racial justice without gender justice is going to be the most effective approach for us to move forward. And so when we look at Black girls and how they are impacted by policing, there are definitely some similar ways, but there are unique ways in which we find that for Black girls and gender nonconforming youth, when they engage in negative encounters with police, it's often close to home. Literally at their home, right? We have the Breonna Taylors, we have the 9-year-old, right, in Rochester that you brought up, or in other places that are supposed to be safe, such as their schools. And those two places are often seen as areas where police inflict harm and violence for Black girls, is because Black girls tend to, or police, I should say, tend to be over-relied on for Black girls when it comes to responses to trauma. So we see Black girls being harmed by police when they're actually seeking help. When, right, the family is calling for support because a Black girl is suicidal. When a school is calling for support because a young girl just identified that she experienced gender-based violence of some sort. And so this over-reliance of policing when it comes to sexual violence, when it comes to trauma responses, has resulted in, here in DC, 60% of girls being arrested in DC are under the age of 15. Right, Black girls in DC are 30 times more likely to be arrested than white youth of any gender identity. And it results in this, we're talking about dehumanization, we're talking about adultification, right? It looks that way because we perceive Black girls just the way we perceive Black boys to be older than they actually are. And so we treat them with less compassion. We treat them without protection. We treat them without dignity and respect that people of all age are deserving of. But in particular, when we're talking about trauma responses, when we're talking about gender-based violence, right? Black girls need to be met with support. They need to be met with love, with mentorship, right? With all of these other factors that come into safety that police simply were not created and are not capable of doing.
Thank you for that. And you did what I wanted you to do, which is to draw out this safety point, that Black girls don't feel comfortable and safe calling the police, even when they need help. And that's a really critical piece to this. And I just wanted to call out, Dr. Goff mentioned it as well, but the study about girls and perceptions of girls being older and more sexually promiscuous and sexually aware, that was prepared by the Center for Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown. So let me turn to our Attorney General, Karl Racine. You know, when you were sworn in as DC's first elected Attorney General, you made it a priority to reduce the harm that over-policing and that the juvenile legal system has on Black and brown youth in the district. And so the question that I have for you, and that actually got submitted by the audience, is what role can prosecutors play in reducing racial disparities in police stops and arrest? And so can I ask you to walk us through maybe 2 or 3 concrete changes that you made to the district's approach to prosecuting young people in court and young Black people that you think have the greatest impact on reducing these racial disparities?
Sure. And first, let me say thank you very much, Kris, for having me. And also, I learned so much from logging in at 3 o'clock. I'm with you on Professor Goff, extraordinary, Dr. Woodland, and also I'm really heartened to be on the same panel with Samantha Davis and Charles Allen and Michael and Pierre. Samantha, I've got to say, you're so powerful, and thank you for your leadership. Charles and I work together every day to bring justice to DC. Let me give you the first example that I had to confront in the District of Columbia. We came into office in January 2015 when the rule in DC Superior Court, where you practiced for so long, Kris, was that kids going into court were shackled. And there was a fierce debate going on, you might recall, with the then chief judge about whether to continue that practice. And sure enough, the chief judge at the time brought up all manner of anecdotes where there were kids who acted out. And he was using those anecdotes to continue the system of shackling all kids. Well, thankfully, my team, people like Seema Gajwani and now Liz Weezer, they had me to talk to kids who were shackled. When we talked to those kids, consistent with the science, what those kids related was that they felt horrified, traumatized. They literally felt like they were shackled like slaves. And in fact, if you look at a picture, you will see that they look like slaves who were shackled. And so immediately we went to work on that issue. And thankfully, we were able, working with the council, to persuade the chief judge to finally take back his order that kids would be shackled in that way. And as we know, from the courthouse to the street, things are not so dissimilar. And so we also found in our tenure early on that the police would oftentimes, for reasons that Mr. Goff really outlined well, treat Black kids like adults and treat them harshly, including handcuffing them in public. When you're handcuffed in public these days, that's just not the people who see you physically. It's the entire United States of America and World Wide Web. And so we went to work with the MPD and tried to get them to bring in a more humane policy, a policy that recognized that kids don't need to be handcuffed in the overwhelming majority of cases. And so we changed the order. We made our lawyers available on a 24-hour basis to be available to the police so that we could help the police in those circumstances where they were inclined to default to handcuffing. And I'm happy to say we've received over 300 calls to our hotline where we guide the police in regards to how to de-escalate the conflict without having to resort to handcuffing. The second example I'll just give really quickly is that we know that kids come into the criminal justice system for reasons usually related to situations at home, their community, and I'd go back to Goff again with history, the history of the legacy and impact of slavery on our families. And so we know that kids need services. And that's why at the Office of Attorney General, working with the DC Department of Human Services, we've really ramped up over my tenure the cases in which we divert kids away from the criminal justice system. Instead, we focus on what their needs are and try to fill their needs by getting their family members or other responsible adults involved with them. Lastly, we found extremely successful that kids do really well, and so do victims of crime when you bring them together in a restorative justice environment where we can figure out what all went wrong and how it is one might repair the wrong without, again, the involvement of the criminal justice system. So those are a couple of examples of what we found much more successful than the tried and true ways, which date back to slavery and Jim Crow.
Yes, these are, I love how you gave 3 examples that are at different continuums along the process. You know, at the time of arrest, what happens in the, in the court, the charging decision right at the front end, and then later in the restorative justice, how do you restore communities? I want to say a word for those of you who are listening who are not from the District of Columbia and are interested in these shackling issues. The National Juvenile Defender Center has collected affidavits from psychologists and experts across the country detailing the traumatic effects of shackling, as Attorney General Racine has spoken about. With regard to diversion, we definitely, I can say as a defense attorney, have seen radically a reduction in the number of children who are formally prosecuted. And you have instituted things like the deferred prosecution agreement.
Absolutely.
And can you say a word about that and the deferred disposition agreement so that other jurisdictions might hear that?
I think the data is overwhelming, and the data tells you that to the extent that you can resolve issues outside of the criminal justice system, the young people have a much better chance of not returning to the system. So opportunities to divert a case, or even when a case comes in, to defer prosecution, to allow for services and families and other aspects to come into play with a kid who's eager to not be in the criminal justice system, is the best off-ramp from the criminal justice system. And I want to tell you that the rates of recidivism are far lower when you keep kids out of the system than when you bring them into the system. And it all makes sense.
This is important for all of us to remember. So thank you for those. And when I circle back to you, we'll talk about what's next. What do we need to do next? But let me turn now to Councilmember Allen. Since you were named the chair of DC's Committee on Public Safety and Judiciary, research has really been at the heart of your reforms that you have championed relating to the sentencing of youth and policing generally. Can you tell us a bit about how the research relating to race, adolescence, and desistance, meaning the natural desistance from normal adolescent behaviors that we have labeled crimes, but how this research has shaped your approach to both oversight and legislating? And I imagine, I hope you'll talk a bit about the Youth Rehabilitation Act in the second look at, to give a little preview.
Absolutely. Well, let me add my thanks as well for being able to join such a great panel, and following Dr. Goff is incredibly hard, I think, for all of us to do. When I came on, one of the great things about the District of Columbia is we're really fortunate to have a deep bench of local and national subject matter experts, great thinkers, academics, advocates, and criminal justice reformers. And in general, have a lot of criminal, our agencies and criminal justice agencies generally, and even our politics generally have a shared philosophy. But of course, at the same time, we are susceptible, just like everywhere else, to have the same type of knee-jerk reactions to crime and public safety, particularly when it relates to kids, to young people, as you define any other jurisdiction. So I think it has been a challenge. I know that I've experienced this, I'll talk about this with the YRA, of how in the heat of a so-called bad case that takes place or splashes across a headline, of how you can take that step back to be able to look at and let the research and the data and the policy guide you and be intentional. Because the reality is that politics are politics everywhere. Government hates change. Power does not like to give up its power. And there's a lot of those dynamics are at play, even in a place when you could make the argument that philosophically we're a little more progressive than other places. Those are still true here as they are going to be anywhere else. So I do like to think of myself as a kind of research and evidence-based type of legislator. I also try to think of myself as a strategic change maker, and really try to bring a core set of progressive values to the work we do. And I think that's kind of where the district is, and certainly where the ward is. And it's good to know that we start from a place of a fairly justice-minded space. But I remember this summer, as I had many of my white neighbors, the number of Black Lives Matter signs that would pop up in yards and windows this summer was affirming. But I also remember telling so many people, like, you don't get to put a sign in the window, pat yourself on the back, and call it a day. There's the next action that we have to take, and so much work that's in front of us. And, I appreciate you mentioning the YRA and IRA in Second Look. When I first got tapped to chair this committee, the Washington Post had just done this explosive expose of trying to highlight some failures of the YRA. And to be clear, there absolutely were some failures to the YRA. But I took over the committee, and I had members of the council, my colleagues, telling me, well, we got to just repeal this thing, toss the whole thing out. And they didn't have an appetite to say, let's take a breath and then fix it. Let's figure out what's working and what's not. We were able to work, frankly, with, the Attorney General's team was amazing in helping support us as we did this work. Advocates that came around us that really helped us pull together all this great thinking. And what we ended up with, because we were able to take a breath and then be able to come up with what's the right position, is we completely transformed the YRA that we hadn't really even touched since 1985, and came up with a legislation that really wrote into law and understood where that young person was and what they needed and how that criminal justice system should be oriented there. We tried to take the same approach with IRA, which is our Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, recognizing the absolute massive disparity that takes place and just the moral failure of these just extreme and long sentences for kids. We've now been able to expand that. And I know there's been a good discussion about having the research and data that helps us talk about that young person's brain development up through age 25 to create those types of chances and opportunities. And it is work that's going to change our city. It changes lives. It changes in deeply dramatic ways. These aren't baby steps. These are huge reforms and big steps that I think are going to make us a better place. And we're able to let the research and evidence guide us. And I think one of the great things is we also have some elected officials that have the guts to go toe to toe with their own neighbors and be able to say, I know that I won't be able to sleep well at night if I don't just make the good decision. If there's gonna be political consequences for it, so be it. But I've got to know that I can sleep well at night at the end of the day. And I think that's where we're fortunate in having a lot of great leaders elected to office, a lot of great leaders that are in the advocacy community that really help us keep moving in the right direction.
And so I want to pick up on a word you said, guts, right? It's having guts and courage, right? Because what was so striking to me about your Youth Rehabilitation Act, and let me be clear for those of you who are not from the District of Columbia, this is a measure. I should let you, Councilmember Allen, state clearly what the YRA, the IRA, as you call it, and the second look, those three, what do they do, just in a sentence, so that the rest of the folks who are watching, because it's a really striking story.
Yeah, and I realize we're using so many acronyms. So the YRA, the Youth Rehabilitation Act, it was originally written in 1985, really had never been touched until we tried to come back to it. In a nutshell, what it does is allows a young person who has a conviction as a young person, be able to have their conviction set aside. And what we end up doing was we were asking judges to essentially use a crystal ball and decide who was worthy of that potential for a set aside and who wasn't at the front end. And judges would tell me, like, we don't have a crystal ball. We're gonna do the best we can. What we ended up doing was completely changing the legislation so that now everyone has the ability to be eligible for that set aside, and really rethought that whole process. The IRA, which is the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, we've now gone through 3 iterations as we continue to expand it. In essence, though, now for the District of Columbia, someone who is convicted of a DC code offense, as initially it started below the age of 18 and it's worked its way up now through age 24. After that individual has served a minimum amount of time and then 15 years, and then they have the ability now to petition back to the courts for resentencing. And then because we don't have our own control over a parole board, we don't have a lot of the pieces. I know you have a national audience. Let me make sure I have one giant plug-in for DC statehood for the over 700,000 people that don't have representation here in the nation's capital. Yep. We don't have control of our own system. And this is one of the ways that we are allowed people to have those extreme sentences, be able to have resentencing. And we've had some amazing success stories for the individuals that have been able to come home.
And I really wanted you to say this because this is so incredibly important. What is so striking about the story, right? You started with a Washington Post story that was trying to expose a scandal, saying that we shouldn't be, giving folks a second chance, and we shouldn't be looking backwards. And yet, the council had courage to say, we're going to do an evidence-based, a research-based response. And not only are we going to keep the Youth Rehabilitation Act alive, we're going to enhance it and then expand it into the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act and, Second Look Act. All of this is incredibly important, given what we know about adolescent development, for example, and how young people grow and improve and develop over time. And all deserve a second chance. So I really think this is important. Let me turn to Mr. Ampere, right? So as the director for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, you provide technical assistance to jurisdictions across the country, right? To improve their legal system, the juvenile legal system. And so we focus pretty heavily for a moment here on what's happening in DC, but we know, Dr. Goff has said that this happens to Black and Brown youth all over the country. So how do the reforms that have been talked about by Councilmember Allen and Attorney General Racine compare to what is happening nationally?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kris, for this opportunity. Such an important and timely conversation. And I'll say that the reforms that Attorney General Racine and Councilmember Allen have detailed really are remarkable. And we need more and more jurisdictions all across the United States to follow their lead. So much of what we've been talking about today, Kris, is how do we leverage the incredible body of research that we have in our field to drive policies and practices and approaches. And, when it comes to achieving positive outcomes for kids and families and communities, the research is quite clear in terms of what we need to do to improve public safety, improve community safety, and achieve other positive outcomes. And one central finding, Kris, from that research, as we've been talking about, is that when it comes to working with kids, when it comes to juvenile justice policy and practice, the path to achieving those outcomes, to improving public safety, is not through the traditional correctional model that we have implemented historically in our system, one that features punishment and control and surveillance and fear. Instead, the research is quite clear that the path to positive outcomes is by implementing a truly developmental and therapeutic model, right? What that means is, in our approaches, we are recognizing the differences between kids and adults. We're doing everything that we can to help them transition successfully into adulthood. We're helping kids develop skills and foster positive relationships to pro-social caring adults and peers. And we're meeting the basic needs of youth and families alike holistically, right? So that we can promote their health and their well-being. So I think, Kris, that our field has benefited from this research, and we have seen reforms like the ones that Attorney General Racine and Councilmember Allen have described, but there's a lot more work to be done, and we need more and more jurisdictions to follow suit.
And so that's exactly where I want to pivot. So actually, you can be my sort of first question in this next sort of round of questions that I want to ask you all, which is gets us to where we want to go next, right? So there's been talk, across the country. I mean, Dr. Goff described this. This is a moment for us to have this conversation, but what are we going to do with it, right? And so there's been a lot of talk about reforming policing in America, but we often don't focus specifically on policing of children and adolescents, this very narrow category. And there's certainly some good work from Strategies from Youth led by Lisa Thoreau. But have you seen any good models, any good state models for reforming police-youth relations, particularly involving youth of color at the state level? So as we're beginning to think about what to do, and I'll go ahead and ask you, a number of our audience members have asked, not just at the state level, but what can be done at the national level to drive state-based reform? What are we asking the Biden administration to do in this moment?
Yeah, I think that we, in fact, have seen in pockets of the country, in various areas, reforms that are really promising. I think they're in line with what we've talked about today. One of the things that we know is that we advance this developmental model best when we keep kids in communities, in their homes, engaged in school, supported by the full network of supports in their life, right? And so efforts like Attorney General Racine was outlining that focus on keeping kids out of the system in the first place and connected to essential services really is an important strategy. And we have seen that across the country. I think about programs like the Philadelphia Police School Diversion Program, right? This is a collaborative effort led by the Philly Police Department in concert with Philly schools and the Department of Human Services and other agencies who've come together and said, we need to reduce school-based arrests, particularly for youth of color. We need to keep them out of the justice system. So let's intentionally focus on that. And a program like that has been able to demonstrate that you can do that while maintaining school safety and improving community safety as well. Other jurisdictions at the state level have embraced this notion of keeping kids out of the system. For example, states like Florida and Delaware have embraced a civil citation approach. Again, similar strategy, alternative to formal judicial handling, where for certain offenses, kids are, instead of going deep into the system, they're connected to community-based services where they can, their needs can be met. And that restorative justice component that Attorney General Racine was talking about is a huge part of that, right? So to the extent that there has been harm to victims or to the community, the young people are really working to repair that harm. And so we've seen that. But I've got to say, Kris, that it's not those programs, those diversion efforts, that's just a part of the puzzle.
Yep.
We're not going to get where we need to go with respect to policing and the relationships with young people unless we begin to get into the culture of law enforcement agencies. And part of the way that we do that, and again, echoing Dr. Goff here, is just one sliver of it, but an important sliver is on training, is on education. The group that you mentioned, Kris, Strategies for Youth, has been a leader in this respect in terms of developing training specifically for police officers with this developmental model in mind. But an analysis that Strategies for Youth did a number of years ago was they wanted to take a look at what percentage of time in police training academies did officers actually spend on juvenile justice and youth-related issues, right? And what they found was that roughly 1% of the entire time that officers are in the training academy was dedicated to juvenile justice and youth issues. That is absolutely unacceptable, right? When we think about the number of interactions and encounters between police and youth, we know they have to be trained in adolescent development. We know that the majority of kids have been, who are, ultimately touch the system, have been exposed to trauma. So our officers have to be trained in trauma responsive practices. They need to be trained on implicit bias and racial bias and cultural responsiveness, as we've been talking about. They need to be given the tools and the concrete strategies around de-escalation. And so I think that training is part of the puzzle here, Kris, but it's got to be backed by policies and clear standards around police-youth relations. There's been some movement, but by and large, those standards don't exist at the state level, so we need that. And it needs to be coupled with accountability measures on the part of the police and transparency in terms of making sure that we've got data to show the impact of law enforcement working hand in hand with the community. So what can we do at the federal level? I think the Biden administration has a tremendous opportunity to advance the conversation here. The federal government can build upon the foundation of that 21st Century Policing Task Force report that was mentioned earlier in the session. That report and the implementation guide that followed had a series of really important recommendations that we can build off of, right? And they get at this notion of community policing, at changing the culture of law enforcement so that we're incorporating more of a developmental approach. And the last thing that I'll say in terms of what can be done at the federal level, I think that the Department of Justice, for example, plays an instrumental role in guiding inspiration and innovation and creativity at the state and local level. They can set the tone. They can have these conversations nationally. They can use financial incentives to lift up those promising programs around, really focused on police youth relations, particularly with race equity in mind. So we need to leverage all of that. We need to keep attention on it. And by the way, this is such an important moment in time in our history where there's more increased recognition of the importance of race equity than I think that we have seen in decades. It's not that the system has changed. The system has always been what it is, right? But there's increased recognition about the importance of these issues, and the administration should be leveraging that, capitalizing it, and really moving it to support actionable reform.
Excellent. I just can't tell you how much, how many rich nuggets. Really, you have just summarized a range of research, keeping kids close to home within their support networks, training officers on adolescent development. As indicated earlier, Dr. Woolard and I are working with MPD to develop a module for them, particularly at that intersection of race and adolescent, which is different, right? Which is its own unique thing. There is so much there. Cultural shifts in thinking about how to police youth. All of this is great. And then looking to our federal government to give inspiration, funding, and the like to drive state-based reform. So, but let me push, all right? And I want to push back to Councilmember Allen and ask you one more question, and that is this, right? Really, we have seen some dramatic changes. I am a huge fan of the YRA and the IRA, but we still live in a city, right, where Black youth make up 92% of the children who are arrested, right? But they are only 63% of the youth population in the District of Columbia between the ages of 10 and 17. So if I had to put you on the spot and press you to say, what's one piece of legislation? Well, actually I have two questions for you. I have to. One question is, what is one piece of legislation that you think we have to do right now to address the racial disparities and arrest? And I'm going to throw this at you because all of us want to know, what should we be expecting from the council's new office on racial equity?
Oh, well, I appreciate it. Well, to the point, I mean, I'm really proud of the YRA, IRA, Second Look, all the things, all the acronyms we come up with. But those are the back end fixes, right? Like those are things that we're trying to address things after the harm has already been done. And when we also talk about what do we do to address racial disparity, when you're in the 90s, there's not much of a disparity. It's almost racial uniformity. Like when we think about what the impact is on our young people. So I think that it's hard to say what one thing, right? There's gonna be a couple of different things. I do think policing is front and center. I think that we have to think about it from the perspective of, I think leadership matters, period. When we try to tackle police reform issues, we had a previous police chief who went out to the troops and said, they've abandoned you. Your council has abandoned you because we were putting in accountability and transparency measures. That's not leadership to achieve the type of change that we're trying to make here. So I think the leadership matters a heck of a lot. I think when we look at where we can make big changes, there are things that are taking place right now because of a pandemic that should be taking place, whether it's the pandemic or not. Changing a lot of the ways in which we look at misdemeanors, being able to do a criminal code revision, which we're going to tackle over the next 2 years, moving towards citation. I led the fight on the council when we went to decriminalize fare evasion on Metro. So many things that we can try to change in the culture and the way in which policing works, but we also have systems in place that fully enable the work that's taking place that we're criticizing. And that's part of what has to change as well. And there's not going to be one thing we do. It's going to be a lot of it. Some of it we'll be able to tackle quickly. Some of it will take a couple of years, but it's going to be a sustained effort that I think is really important. And then to your last question around our new office on racial equity, it really is trying to force something that some people assume is there, and it's not fair to assume. We're going to have a new office that really forces every legislation, every budget to have to go through and put a racial equity lens to it. That doesn't mean that necessarily every council member is going to agree on an issue and say, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to do. But if you don't say the words up front, I think it's almost, why is it that we push back so hard when we say Black Lives Matter and someone else says all lives matter? Because you need to intentionally say. And so by having an equity office, I think helps us bring intentionality to make sure that we are considering this through an equity lens. And then we make the decisions. And that doesn't mean, again, we're all going to agree on something, but we have to put it on the table. We have to put it up front. And you have to speak it, or else too often it won't happen.
Excellent. Thank you for that, the naming it, and for your laundry list of the ways in which we can decriminalize much of what leads to these racial disparities. And I'm going to add to your list, we can talk later offline, all the ways to decriminalize normal adolescent behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
There's a nice laundry list. And so let me turn to Attorney General Karl Racine and ask you really a very similar question. Given the racial disparities, what can we do to make sure that children are treated, all children are treated like children? And I want to press you on making sure that children aren't tried as adults anymore, getting rid of what in DC we call Title 16, our juvenile transfer law. I could have asked Councilmember Allen about that one too, but this is the kind of conversation that we need to be having. What can we do?
Well, I'll jump right to that Title 16. What we need to do is get statehood so that we can have a local prosecutor for kids and adults who reflects the values of the District of Columbia. And I think as Charles has done so well, both on the YRA as well as the Second Chance and the second IRA legislation, he's reflected the values of DC residents. DC residents want kids to be treated like kids. They may not have all of the knowledge and all the expertise that we've heard from Michael and Pierre, which I think he did a great job of presenting, and Kris, that you do all the time, as well as the groups like Strategies for Youth with Lisa Thoreau. But DC residents know what fairness really means. And so it's time for us, even in advance of statehood, to push hard to make that next US attorney agree that he or she will not wave up kids as adults when they are just kids. I saw a great presentation by a PhD from Penn State, whose name, sadly, I'm forgetting now, but I'll get that to you. And what she had on a slide was extraordinary. She had a slide of an adolescent, and she had that adolescent's brain. And what she had was a ladder and a big construction sign that said, under construction.
Yes.
That's what kids are going through during that time period. We've got to recognize that. I think Brother Pierre said it best. When police are spending 1% of their time trying to figure out how to interact with young people, they're going to get it wrong most of the time, particularly when there's a bit of history there and fear that a Black boy or Black girl presents, right, when confronting or having an interaction with police. So all that's got to shift. And Samantha is 100% correct. Let's get the police out of the schools.
There we go.
When you talk to young people, I'm sure Samantha has, you know what they say? We need more counselors in the school, because those young people, brains still under construction, a lot of love in their hearts. What they're thinking about is that kid right next to them who's coming to school hungry, poor, sad, and depressed. What is a police officer gonna do for that kid who is rudely teased because he or she is wearing clothes that only he or she's adult in their life can afford, right? Nothing. And so when that kid acts out by being aggressive, the last thing that kid needs is to be put in cuffs, hauled into jail, and then sentenced, God forbid, as an adult. So that's what we've got to do. The other piece I dare to bring into this, and I know that Charles is a big thinker, and I'm happy that he's where he's at because he's going to think about this, but we got to also really figure out how to help our families in great distress. And the reality is, the families in great distress overwhelmingly are led by a young parent, usually a young woman, and their kids or 2 or 3 going through poverty. Good luck having a fair shot if that's the situation and the government is not helping, along with business and the not-for-profit community, solidify that family. So we need to start from day one. I'm talking about pregnancy to day one of birth, supporting our young parents.
Excellent. Start treating children like children starts from birth. So that's really, really significant. So our wonderful Samantha Davis gets the last word, and did not Attorney General Carl Racine set you up? Because that's exactly where I was going with this school. Just set it up. And let me tell you, for those of you who don't know Samantha Davis, she has led DC's charge around, from the advocate's voice, from the community advocate's voice, to get police out of school. I want to add some data to Michael Umpierre's comment that only 1% of time is spent by police officers on youth-related issues. You would think that percentage would be radically higher for school resource officers who are uniquely sent into the schools. And the research shows that it is not across the country, that even police officers sent into schools are not adequately trained on adolescent development. So I'm going to turn to Samantha for our last word before Dr. Woolard comes back to close us. And my question for you is to tell us a little bit, just a word about what you've been doing to lead this police-free schools movement. And the question that the audience has asked is, what are those alternatives? So I'm going to bring us back to exactly where you started. How do we invest in youth and alternatives to school resource officers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the question. I appreciate Attorney General Racine bringing it up. Wanted to start by saying, while it is true, and I agree that DC is leading the way in some respects in terms of youth justice reform, we are quite honestly, lagging when it comes to directly addressing the front end of policing and the encounters that police and young people have every day. Like, how do we reduce the footprint of policing in our communities, in our schools? And DC has not been leading in that regard. And we know that it's necessary, right? Like, how do we get from point A to point B? How do we address police violence? For us, for police-free schools, right, it is very much about removing police from schools, knowing that schools are a microcosm of the community. And if we can have schools without police, then we can have communities without police. And so police-free schools is a movement that, while I appreciate the introduction that I am not leading in DC, that Black youth and brown youth are leading in DC, are leading nationally and really leading globally, and have been doing for decades, right? It is very clear, again, what young people want. They want a divestment from police in their schools and their communities, as well as an investment into all of the resources that truly bring about health and safety. And so this isn't a call or a denial of that violence is real, right? People know and live the violence in our communities every single day. So this isn't a denial of that. What it is a call that we are being complicit in that violence when we don't acknowledge the trauma and the harm that police themselves are doing to our young people in our schools. And so some of the things that looks like and how we can address that head on is very much looking at legislation, looking at the city and the school's budget as moral documents, looking at school practices and policies that divest from police, that disarm police, that demilitarize the police, that deprioritize policing as a first response, and doing all that's necessary to build up social infrastructure, because we know that police really, if anything, are just responding to systemic failures of our society, to the social ills of our society. So building up that social infrastructure, investing radically in those infrastructures, and in context of schools, right, that will allow us to build a liberatory learning environment. Again, knowing that if we have liberatory schools, which we can, and we do all over the country, then we can surely have liberated communities. So it's really being intentional about naming what is causing harm and divesting from it, at the same time investing in all of those things that will bring about the change that we seek. So it's a both and, not let's invest in all of these things and continue to cause harm and violence, but let's intentionally address the trauma and the harm and the violence that everyone will agree happens when police encounter Black and brown youth. So divesting from that and investing in all those other things: mental health supports, violence interrupters, community members, right, who know the young people the best, who have the relationships with the mommies and the aunties and the grandparents, right? Mutual aid, how are we addressing the immediate needs of our young people and of our families? And it's also ensuring that by decriminalizing young people, that we aren't in turn just criminalizing their families, right, and pushing them into the child welfare system. And so it's this larger acknowledgement that when we talk about removing police from schools, we're talking about the entire policing infrastructure. We're talking about the police in our heads, that police our bodies, police our culture, police our self-expression. And that looks very harmful when we're talking about Black bodies, Black girls, so on and so forth.
Superb. Man, I just want to end right there and hope that all of you were taking notes: divest, invest, deprioritize policing. There were so many good nuggets. I certainly have found this conversation to be very enriching, very enlightening. And you know, you're all recorded. So I will be coming back to you to hold you all accountable, Council Member, Attorney General, and our fabulous leaders for moving the District of Columbia forward in these really, really important reforms. So I thank you for where DC has come, and I thank you all for committing to moving us to the next space. I say thank you to the advocates like Samantha, who are helping our young voices be heard. I thank you to Michael and Pierre for always bringing to light best practices, research-driven practices, providing technical assistance to all of you. So to all of us. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you. And Dr. Willard, you all can stay on. Dr. Willard, if you'll close us out, that would be awesome.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
Kris. And thanks to all of our panelists. I feel like you've closed us out really well, Kris. So let me echo the thanks to you for facilitating this, to say that as a researcher, it is so heartening to hear the commitment to using the science in ways that are going to promote the health and well-being of families. Having testified before Councilman Allen's committee, having trained in Attorney General Racine's staff, worked with Michael and Pierre on evaluation, being pushed appropriately by advocacy groups and children to ask the questions and to lift their voices into the research that we're doing is important for the research community to be able to engage with you all in ways that then you can move this forward to improve the situations for children and families. DC is a great exemplar, I think, on this panel of both the ways we have used research and the potential to move forward even further, right, in doing that. Thank you all so much for joining us and for staying with us on a Friday afternoon. As Kris mentioned, there will be a recording available next week, probably up on the Law Center's YouTube site. You can continue the conversation on social media with our hashtag treating all kids like kids. Thank you again for being with us. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone.